a couple of reminders this morning, one of which is from 10 to 10:30 during the break. That's going to be our final opportunity to go visit with exhibitors. And just like sponsors, conferences like this are not possible without having the exhibitors that are here and those companies that spend their time, their effort to be with us. So during that break, please go and visit them one last time. We do ask that everybody silence their phones this morning. And hey, let's go ahead and get this thing started. It's an honor to be able to moderate this panel with Joe and Ann. Now, the session that we have this morning, they're going to look back on the death of a coworker and how that shifted their thinking on safety. So it's not just a subject matter that we're going to be hearing. It's going to be a very personal story. Now, Ann Cook, she is the safety director for Custom Agri-Systems Incorporated, a family-owned agricultural construction contractor in Napoleon, Ohio. Ann joined Custom Ag in 2022. Previously, she worked as a senior safety manager for Amazon and for 26 years in a variety of EHS roles at the Andersons. You obviously started when you were like 5. Okay. Joe Mlynek is a safety consultant with Progressive Safety Services and a partner of Safety Made Simple. Joe's a graduate of Bowling Green University, and I learned just this morning that when Joe was a college student, he helped set up ballrooms for conferences just like this. So he was able to critique exactly what we have here this morning. We've got a pro in a whole variety of ways. Joe started his safety career in the automotive industry in 1996 and has since worked in the grain handling, construction, manufacturing, and maritime systems. Ann and Joe began working together in high school. Now, did you go to high school together, or you just began working together?
I went to high school.
Love that. Great. And their careers have been intertwined for the past 35 years. They both expect this to be true whenever they hang up their careers, which is not going to happen anytime soon. Joe also works with National Grain and Feed Association on their safety education and training related issues. Folks, it is my honor and my privilege to introduce this morning Joe Mlynek and Ann Cook. Let's give them a round.
I think you're too close to the podium, maybe?
I don't know, I'm waiting for him to. Do you have the presentation queued up?
There we go.
I need a teleprompter, kind of like people we know. Let me back up here a little bit. I want to tell you a couple things about Ann. The one thing I know about Ann is, you see this picture here, she's, 150 feet in the air in a crane basket. When I met Ann as an intern, she was terrified of heights. I remember holding her hand and her crawling on her hands and knees to cross a bridge, up in the air, those types of things. But it goes to show you a little bit about Ann, that she conquers what's in her path, and that's what I appreciate about her. She's also an excellent safety professional as well. I'll tell you a couple funny things about Ann. One, we're talking about SIFs today. If she doesn't have her snacks at a certain time in the morning, she gets pretty angry. And the potential that somebody could get injured is very possible. The other thing is, and I think Mark Avery learned this just yesterday, if you get to know Ann, do not ask her if she ever played basketball.
The answer is no.
Because you will get hurt. But on a serious note, we're here today to talk about our friend Rod and our colleague Rod, who passed away on November 3rd of 2006. And the picture that you see here is a prayer card that I've been carrying around. You can see it's pretty beat up. I keep it in a piece of plastic. It was in my office for 3 years. I keep it in my briefcase. It's traveled thousands of miles with me over the last 18 years. And it's a reminder to me of how important our jobs is. I know our jobs are, I know there are a lot of safety professionals in here. I know there's a lot of safety leaders. And what I mean by safety leaders is if you make decisions that impact people's lives, you're a safety leader. So it doesn't have to be a leader by title. So Our story today is a story of our friend and colleague who was killed in an engulfment incident. It's also the story of a company that shifted their direction after that happened. I think today's topic has a lot of connection with the HOP presentation yesterday. We were maybe a little ahead of the game there, but what you saw yesterday is taking it to the next level. So that's, before I turn it over to Ann, that's what our goal today is, just to have some impact with this. When we thought about this presentation, I thought, talking about Rod would make a lot of sense.
So part of our reason for sharing the story about Rod was because we recognized, looking back, that was a true watershed moment for the company's safety culture. It was such a huge reckoning that things needed to change, and we felt it was very important to the context of this SIF prevention strategy presentation to share that with you. So people have asked me about my presentation today, and they're like, "Are you nervous?" And I'm like, "No." I can't really say I'm excited to tell the story, but I know it's important. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't practiced this because it kind of lives rent-free in my head, as people like to say. But yeah, let's talk about that day on November 3rd. It was a Friday, and I remember I had packed my lunch, and I was sitting at the tables in the center of our office with the two guys who led our plant emergency organization, or fire brigade. Their names were Roger and Steve, and we had sat down, and I can remember vividly, Steve was sitting in front of me, Roger was to my left, and at that time we were kind of like the plant radio monitors. So we had a plant radio that had all the channels on it, and it would pick up any communications, and you were just kind of used to hearing the sounds and the cadence of people talking on the radio, track movements, what have you. And all of a sudden, at 11:30 that Friday morning, we remember hearing one of our grain operations coworkers, Sean, start yelling on the radio. "I need payloaders, I need people to come to tank 2. We have somebody buried in grain." And I mean, it was just like this time froze moment, and the three of us just kind of looked at each other, and then all of a sudden, Steve and Roger sprang up and ran to our PEO supply room to grab the rescue tube and some additional supplies. And that was all I heard. It was literally the three of us in the office that morning, nobody else. They left. I'm by myself, hearing what's happening on the radio traffic, having no idea who it is or what's happened. Now, one of the ironic things about that day, looking back, is that there were 24 grain tanks behind the building where we officed. And it was the tank that we could see the best from the back of our office. So if I went out the back door, I had a direct line of sight to what was happening. And had that happened in any other tank, I might not have been able to see it. But in this case, I basically did have a front row seat to what was going on. I just didn't know who it was or why it had happened. So at that point, the phones start ringing. This is pre-cell phones, or maybe they were just picking up and getting started, but nobody had them. But anyways, the plant landlines start ringing, our office landlines start ringing, and people want to know what's going on, what's happening. We've heard there's an emergency, and I have no information to share because the two people who know are outside dealing with it. So I'm getting bits and pieces, over radio communications and radio traffic, and I'm just trying to maintain kind of the office process. And then Roger calls back to the office on the phone, and he says it's Rod. Now, let me give you a little backstory on Rod and I. So everybody knew Rod. Rod was a very experienced, very tenured grain operations supervisor. He was not new. He was very well trained. He knew the processes and the grain operations very well. He was also my husband's high school classmate. He was also my landlord and my neighbor. So I lived 4 doors down from him and his wife, Jamie, and I used to babysit their oldest son, Colin. So when I heard it was Rod, the floor literally fell out from underneath me. Like I was so shocked that it would be someone so experienced and knowledgeable buried in grain. Like I couldn't even process it. So at that point, I'm, like I said, answering the phones, trying to tell people what's going on. Our PR person's on her way over. By the way, first week on the job, corporate PR. She's got to deal with this. And people are starting to come in the office, and I know that Joe is traveling that day, so I call him. I guess we did have cell phones back then, because I remember calling you, and you asked who it was, and I told you it was Rod, and it was just, kind of that moment of silence, like, oh my God. And so from there, the process was what it was. They were able to, pull him out, and he was gone. I remember his wife Jamie coming into the office, and I got to tell you this too. When I say that day lives rent free in my head, I remember it in very vivid snapshots of time. I don't remember it as a contiguous event. I just remember these very vivid, very clear snapshots. And one of those is his wife Jamie coming into the office, and our operations manager from Grain taking her into Joe's office because he wasn't there and it was private, and closing the door. And of course I could hear everything that was going on, and him telling her, what had happened, and her crying. I remember them taking her out to the tank, and they had Rod in the back of the, I don't remember if it was an ambulance or the coroner's.
It was a coroner.
Okay. I just remember him being like on a gurney type situation. And I was looking out the back door of our office, and I could see her kiss his cheek. And that was just really, really crazy to see that moment between the two of them. I remember Rod's sister walking his mom into our office. So I've now seen, the widow and the mom experiencing their grief and their shock firsthand. And I remember it so vividly. She had a walker because she was, had trouble walking on her own, and she was just weeping. And we became this corporate hub for all of the responders, the family members, the company leadership and higher ups, all kind of came to our office and dealt with things amongst all of us. And while it was nice to kind of be able to share that grief real time with other people, it was very, very stark, and just a moment I'll never forget.
Yeah, as Ann said, I was traveling home. I actually got 2 calls. Roger and Steve, who she talked about, had just started to report to me, and Steve called me and he said we had an engulfment, and I thought, like, we'll get them out, right? I mean, we've got 20 guys that are trained in this. Our company was at the forefront of grain rescue. Our company invented the rescue tube. It's called the Rinker tube. So we trained on this, and I thought, we'll just get this guy out. And he said, I'm going out there, but he didn't seem really optimistic, and Ann called maybe 5 minutes later. And I just remember, Ann, you saying, it's Rod, and I felt so helpless because I'm an hour out. And by the time I get there, this is a picture that was in the paper that I found. And these guys were the guys that were trying to get him out.
His coworkers.
Yeah, his coworkers and people that reported to him. And I got back, and his mother, and I think maybe, I don't know if his brother, were in my office. I had a couch in there and stuff, and they were sitting in there, and the facility manager, and I went out back, and what Ann mentioned, I saw Rod on a gurney, the color purple, that I can't get out of my head. And to see his wife, kiss him on the cheek for the last time, hardest thing I've ever seen, to have to see that. So, prior to this incident, our company was recognized as an industry leader. Like, we did a lot of talks at Jeeps, and people would call us and benchmark us, and people recognized who we were. And we had a robust internal safety management system that we built internally. At the time, there was another company out there, and most of you know who they are, came to our office. I think Ann was in the meeting with me, and our boss arranged the meeting, and he says, let's just give them, an opportunity to show us what they do. And when they were done, we showed them what we did. And they looked at us and said, you guys don't need us. We were really good at those types of things. We had a comprehensive auditing program. Ann and I were auditors. We spent more time together a lot of times than we did with our family. But that's what we did. That was a big piece of our program. We had employee training. We did classroom training. Rod sat in the front row of many of the trainings that I did. He was also the safety coordinator of that facility as well. We had online training to supplement that. We did hands-on. And the prior 5 years, we're feeling pretty good. We decreased our incident rates by 50%. But as I mentioned yesterday, it really doesn't mean anything. Right? We're riding high, right? Yeah, we're doing pretty good, right? Let's just keep doing the same thing. So you have something like this happen, and it's a punch right in the face. When I grew up, Mike Tyson was the boxing champion. And he has a line that everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And we got smacked right in the face. And we sat there and said, how did we not see this coming? And that's, we owned it. We owned it. We said, as auditors, how did we not ask the right questions? How did we not see this? The manager felt the same way. And we just knew that we had to make a shift. And that's, our lesson today is the shift that we made. And hopefully you can make the shift if you haven't already and change some things. So our CEO basically told us, our department, we have to make sure that this never happens again. So we put together what we called the Safety Improvement Initiative. And our CEO was on that committee, representatives from our 4 business groups, upper management, our safety department. I had the privilege of leading that team for 4 years, 2 years as an employee, and 2 years after I left the company to start consulting. It was, despite Rod's incident, it was the best experience I ever had. We had human resource, corporate communications, as Ann mentioned, we want to get the word out to as many people as possible. And we brought in an external consultant. And we knew that what we were doing was really all we knew we could do. So we hired a company. At the time, there were a couple behavioral-based safety companies out there. One was Behavioral Science Technologies, BST. They were bought by Dacra. And they were in the forefront. We didn't really take the traditional behavioral-based approach, though, that you do observations and all that type of thing. They had this system. We piloted at one facility, and it never really took off. But we knew we needed this different set of eyes, this different perspective. We needed a new path forward. And Luis Sanchez, I put his picture on this slide for a reason. He was the most influential person in my safety career, not because he taught me how to guard machines and fix extension cords, but he taught me strategies and philosophies on safety. And he was a dynamic character. I know, Ann, you want to talk a little bit about his background.
I mean, the guy had a resume to beat all resumes. He was, and you probably remember the detail, I don't, but I just remember he was elite in the mechanical engineering field, but yet had such a strong interpersonal skill set. And he was so meaningful to our career. I still think of him, on occasion now, but one of the things that I remember about Luis as he was teaching us this new way of thinking on safety was he was all about, taking action and creating action. And if you had identified risks, which Joe's going to explain how we did that here in a minute, and maybe some of those risk mitigation plans would take time and money and resources, he would challenge you and say, in the meantime, what are you going to do? Or meanwhile, what are you going to do to help mitigate that risk? And that was a really interesting mindset for me of, we can't just wait 18 months for capital plans to be approved. We have to do something in the short term. So that was one of the gifts that he gave us.
Yeah, he graduated from MIT, and if you know anything about MIT, it's one of the most prestigious technical schools in the world. Immigrated from Mexico, just a fantastic person. He's one of those guys that you meet and you say, can a person actually be that good? He was very humble. He would shake when he spoke because he was so passionate about safety. And he came out of the automotive field, but somehow he ended up in safety, and I'm so glad that he did. Our first step as a company when we hired BST was to do an engagement survey. They wanted us to use their survey. So what they wanted us to do was get a clear picture of where we were culturally. And we said, well, we're already sending out an engagement survey, but let's add 10 questions around safety, and they provided these to us, and we sent that out. So we learned a lot about our company. We learned some good things and some bad things. When you do a survey, you're gonna find out some things that you might wanna hear, and then you're gonna find out some things where you're like, oh man, did I really wanna know that? We found out that our employees actually did believe that we were concerned about their safety. That was a good thing. That's a win for us. The second one I'm gonna talk about here was probably something that everybody in this room deals with. Safety was important, but sometimes overshadowed by production. I believe, and I'm not playing Monday morning quarterback, that had something to do with Rod's situation as well. That's a barrier that all of us face. They also use the term that you guys work in silos, and I'm not talking about you work in concrete silos, you know. The fact that we worked in silos, that our individual facilities did not share ideas, they didn't talk, they didn't, you know, there was really no engagement amongst them. So, and the last one was we didn't lead with safety. And I'm gonna talk about what leading with safety is here in a little bit. We also focused on lagging indicators. We had all the graphs, charts, reports, 10 pages of reports and all that kind of stuff. And as we found out yesterday in the hot presentation, none of that really matters when you have something like this happen. We also believe that preventing non-serious injuries would eliminate the potential that something bad would happen like a fatality or a severe injury. And that was just the thought back then. That was the school of safety. That's what I was taught. We focus on all these little things and then that big thing's not gonna happen. And I will tell you that we were absolutely wrong.
That was my reckoning moment too, was that prior to Rod's accident in 2006, we had spent 12 years working together, and we were very, very focused on compliance, machine guarding, HAZMAT systems, training, permits. We had a very extensive administrative survey process that I helped to lead, where I would check, you know, all of the files, all of the record-keeping requirements, from posting your OSHA log to training files and everything in between. We climbed every ladder, went down every tunnel. Well, I didn't climb every ladder. I climbed every ladder.
Eventually.
But it was very, very extensive and very equipment-based or condition-based safety, completely foregoing the behavioral side of safety. And the moment of Rod's accident was so crazy to me because I kept thinking there was nothing wrong with that tank. Rod had the training, and to Joe's point, was a safety committee member and a safety champion of his facility. He had the experience. He had the time, because this was the middle of the day. It didn't need to be rushed, although there was maybe some other contributing factors of an Ohio State game the next day that he didn't want to work on a Saturday for. But it was just that moment of, you can have a very, very safe facility and equipment, and people can still die. And that blew my mind, and frankly, almost made me quit, because I'm thinking, well, what the heck am I doing? I'm spending all this time auditing these records and this paperwork and training and climbing all the things and leaving my family behind to do all that, and people can still die? How is that possible?
So when you start looking at SIFs, serious injuries and fatalities, and that, to me, that's somewhat of a new term. I mean, it's probably the last 5-6 years that term became very popular. And when you look at the data, what we see is that the number of non-serious injuries continues to trend downward, yet the number of fatalities continues to trend upward. So it's further proof that this belief that we had was completely wrong. So I want to talk a little bit about how we shifted our focus and kind of what we had to shift. So we had to really look at shifting from preventing non-serious injuries to serious injuries and fatalities. So back then we didn't use SIF, the term SIF. BST called it fatality prevention. If you're going to start somewhere, you got to start with those things. You got to find out what those are, and you got to do something about them. We wanted to shift from silos to employee engagement. We wanted to get people working, particularly the people that were down in the trenches. We also wanted to focus on exposure versus conditions. This is such a basic concept, but so important for anybody to just really understand this. You can have two concentric circles, a worker and a hazard. If they don't intersect, you don't have exposure. But when you have a worker and a hazard, and when they do their task, they get into their working interface and they interact with their tools, their equipment, their systems, and their processes, those two circles interlap, and that's where they interconnect, and that's where you have exposure, that little point right there in the middle that you see on that screen. That's exposure. So what it boils down to is people don't get hurt a lot of times by conditions. They get hurt doing something that put them in a situation that now they are engaged with this hazard that's in their working interface. So we also had to focus, as Ann mentioned, shifting from a culture of compliance to one of concern for our employees. So like Ann said, we had all the stuff. We had all the programs, policies, felt good. We never talked about OSHA. We had all that stuff. We weren't worried about that at all. But we had to get more concerned. We had to express that to employees. So, how did we make that shift? We did a leadership survey, which was kind of interesting. I know Ann was involved in it. I was. So I had a couple people reporting to me. And I think it's back there. You had people that were on your same level at the company that took this survey on your leadership skills, people that worked for you, and then people that you reported to. And you learned about your leadership styles, and then there was coaching. Luis and his team would do coaching. So they did coaching sessions with Ann and I and that kind of thing. But one of the things they extrapolated from that, as well as this engagement survey, was there was really these 4 areas, and we added one ourselves, that we needed to focus on. The first was leading with safety. The second was feedback and recognition. The third was accountability, collaboration, and then we actually used a job safety analysis process to foster collaboration at our company, to get people working together. So BST had some, and I was looking back at some of the, these courses were half a day, some were a day long, a lot of exercise, a lot of homework, a lot of follow-up and coaching sessions. That about 89 to 95% at that time, what BST was estimating was that these serious injuries and fatalities were something to do with behavior. A lot of times choices people made or systems, or they didn't have safeguards in place, those types of things. And that 20% were based on conditions. So here we are focusing all of our efforts on conditions in the facilities, and really it's these interaction and this working interface that's causing the actual incidents themselves. So when I talk that working interface, when I mention that, that's when people interact with tools, equipment, processes, and their systems. So, opening a tank door, for instance, is a process that they had, a system in place that they have for doing that. I want to talk about leading with safety because I'll ask people, do you lead with safety? And they say, yeah, we start every meeting with the safety message. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But leading with safety comes down to really before you make decisions, when we make decisions, we consider the safety of others, the impact on exposure, and the effect they have on culture. So when I make a decision, and I'm glad you're taking the picture, because if I were here, this is the one I'd want you to take right here. This is what we want people to start asking before they make a decision. How does my decision affect the safety of others? Okay. We have to do this today. I'm going to make this decision that we're going to do it this way. What is the impact on exposure? So we just learned what exposure is. So we plan for a certain level of exposure every day when we come into the work environment. From the minute you wake up in the morning, you put your seatbelt on, you're planning for risk. There are situations where the level of risk is going to go up above what you plan for. And it's all of these things, when we looked at those lines yesterday that Andre was showing us, there are all these, the weather, different types of factors that impact things. So what is the impact on exposure? And the last is, what is the effect that they have on culture? So if I am a manager and I'm going to, open a tank door or something like that, and I decide instead of sending somebody up on top and dropping a light down and getting a real good view to see if that door is flush, that we're not going to do that on that particular day. We're just going to send somebody up the ladder to shine a flashlight in there and make a judgment call. You know, I had a process that we usually normally used, and I deviated from it. What is the message that that sends? You know, you probably have supervisors that will skip a step because of production or whatever it is, and I live in the real world, I understand, but that has an effect on the culture of the company. So when we look at leading with safety, you know, the behaviors that we look at, we want people to lead with is to promote cooperation and collaboration when they solve safety problems, to provide feedback on positive and negative safety performance, and to hold people accountable as well for their responsibilities. That's a piece of it. So collaboration actually builds trust, leads to better business decisions. We found that the trust level when we did surveys later of leaders went up after we educated folks and started to put these things into process. It also requires embracing and supporting ideas that you might not agree with. Ann and I didn't agree on a lot of things, but we always came to common ground on things. So as part of our collaboration effort, what we did is we rolled out a job safety analysis process. We trained over 300 job safety analysis facilitators at our company. And this was where we were starting to get people to work as teams at facilities and identifying SIF precursors or activities that had the ability to seriously injure somebody or kill them. So these teams were made up of ops folks, managers, maintenance, and we targeted these activities that the frontline employees identified and started to really try to address just the exposure piece of it and drive as much exposure out of the workplace as possible. When I talk about feedback and recognition, that was another one of the educational efforts that we had. It was the definition of that is providing specific information to your coworkers to affect their safety performance. So one of my pet peeves with feedback is when somebody tells me good job. Because I really, what did I do that was so good, right? I don't know what I did. When I know what I did, I'll do it again because I know that you approved of that and that had a positive impact. So Luis taught us in these courses, and this is something you have to practice. I still practice it today. I'm an introverted guy. I don't like to go up to people and just start talking to them. But I force myself to do these things, and they work. This is, in the acronym, it's called CAR feedback, context, action, result. So when the behavior occurred, specific actions or behaviors that were effective, and the impact on the individual or the organization. So if I have a gentleman and I'm doing a walkthrough or an inspection with somebody, and I see somebody like this gentleman here, I think I vetted this picture okay, but with safety people in the room, they'll probably find something he's doing wrong. He's got, everybody's an expert. He's got safety glasses and a face shield on. And that's, you know, most of the companies I work with, we require that or goggles because it's the best way to protect them. So I would say, you know, his name's Chuck. I go up to him and say, Chuck, I noticed when you were grinding in the shop today that you had your safety glasses and your face shield on. We've had a rash of injuries over the years, people digging metal shards out of their face, out of their eyes, going to the hospital, bad stuff. By doing that, you're protected, man. Nice job. So what is he gonna do? He's gonna keep doing it. I gave him positive reinforcement. That's success feedback. There's also guidance feedback. You're gonna run into the guy out there, we'll call him Butch, and Butch is using a grinder and he doesn't have a face shield on. So normally when I am with somebody, like maybe a supervisor, and I say, hey, shouldn't that guy have a face shield on? They say yes, and they stand there, and I go, well, you're gonna say something to him, right? And a lot of the time they go over and he'll just jump all over this guy. Guy gets defensive, the opportunity's already lost. So with CAR feedback, we did the success feedback. This is guidance. Now I'm going to try to shift that employee's behavior to doing something that supports our safety effort. So I use context, action, result, desired action, desired result. So I go up to him and I say, Dean, I noticed that you were grinding earlier. You didn't have your shield on. I know you got safety glasses on. That's okay, but we really need to wear the face shield with it in conjunction. We've had a rash of injuries, guys digging metal out of their face. I'm concerned about you. Can you do that for me? You do that, I think you're protected. Chances are you're going to keep your eyesight. You do that for me, and he's probably going to say what? Yeah, I'll do that. Sure, no big deal. He's not defensive anymore. I showed express concern for him. But this is feedback that we were taught. I still try to use it. It's good stuff. You got to practice it. Repetition is so important. With accountability, around accountability, the no name, no blame kind of stuff is something that we focused on as well. I know Andre talked about that yesterday. Accountability is a positive thing. We put a negative spin on it because we always associate it with discipline. I got to hold you accountable. We got rules. You got to be accountable, that kind of thing. Effective leaders help people be accountable. You want people to be accountable for their safety and the safety of others. So you also want to get to the point in your company where if I see Dean doing something that, and I'm not his boss or anything, but I see him without a face shield on, that I know how to give him feedback and say, hey man, I'm concerned about you. We got to wear that face shield. You're going to get hurt. Let's get you home, that kind of thing. So we focus on commitment rather than compliance, set a lot of safety standards, those types of things. Some of the additional efforts that we did were we implemented a really robust near-miss reporting process. We reported to a guy that was actually the head of our fertilizer division. And he tasked me with this near-miss reporting. He had done some homework and he said, Joe, I want you to figure this out. So we implemented a near-miss reporting program that really increased the amount of engagement, and it also really brought to light a lot of exposure that was out in our facilities. We included safety as a job accountability. Before this incident, we didn't have safety in job descriptions, and it was not part of a performance evaluation process. So everything else was important, but safety wasn't included in that. So we changed that fairly quickly as well. We improved our incident analysis process, which was fairly non-existent prior to this, and we used some tools that didn't focus on the employee, which is common. Like somebody gets hurt, their fault, we're going right at them. We actually had 6 different variables that we would look at. We focus on safe operating procedures. Those arose out of our JSA efforts. We also incorporated leading metrics, leading indicators into our metrics. So we use things like near miss, or we think they changed the name after I left to exposures. We were reporting thousands of these things. Our CEO said, each one of these near miss things is a blessing. The more of them we can get, the better. And I've done some webinars on near miss reporting. There's a way you have to go about it, because the big barrier there is the fear of discipline, but you can manage that and take that out of the equation. We also established leadership behaviors at all levels of the organization. These helped as well with job descriptions and the performance evaluation process. So if I were a senior leader, even the CEO, you got 5 or 10 behaviors that we came up are things that would support our mission of safety. One of them might be, we need you to go to 50% of the facilities every year. This is a lot, this is effort. With the sole purpose of engaging people on safety when you go out there. Tell a story about how safety impacted you. Talk to the people about, express how important it is to them. We also, when we addressed exposure, we drilled this into people's heads. This was posters in our facilities. We talked about it in training. Any of the people that have worked with me in this room know that when I'm out, when we identify hazards, we walk through this. The hierarchy of controls. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but when we identified exposure through our JSA processes and our near-miss reporting, this is the methodology that we used. We started at the top and worked our way down. When you're looking at things that are high potential near misses and things like that, or anything that has SIF potential, we disregarded administrative controls and PPE. We really focused on the top 3. We wanted to get rid of that hazard altogether, that exposure. We either wanted to substitute it or use some type of engineering controls. And that's always a big challenge with people, particularly working as a consultant. We just continue repetitively. We just go over that and use it all the time. With SIF prevention, what I would recommend, and I think Ann and I have both discussed this, I use a term called conversation-based safety. I probably should have put a trademark on that. I wrote an article on this a couple years ago. I believe in this, and it's so simple. Anybody can do it. Dean's really good at it. We work together, and he's really good at it. You want to know what SIF potential is in your facility, you need to ask your employees. You need to sit them down in a group, in a room, lock the door, and say, we got to come up with 5 to 10 things at this facility that you do, tasks that you do, that could seriously injure or kill you. And that's where you start. You can look at past data and all that. That's another way of doing it. But again, engagement is important, getting people involved in the process. So we did this in teams. You had maybe a manager, mostly frontline employees, maintenance people, that kind of thing, and they just bang these things out. So anything that's high risk is something that can seriously injure somebody. I'm talking amputations or possibly kill them. So we identified these SIP precursors as well through our job safety analysis process. So we took those 5 to 10 behaviors and then we put them under a microscope. We broke these tasks down into steps and we identified hazards and then we tried to flush them out. And ultimately you end up with somewhat of a procedure or a system in place as well to address that. I almost forgot the little.
That's all right. I would have stopped you. One of the things that I do to take a little bit different tact with this method, because my current employer hires millwrights for a construction industry, it's very rare for us to get millwrights in a room. It's very hard to get millwrights in a room, but I can get their attention on a job site. So one of the things that I like to do when I go out and do a job site safety audit is we will have that conversation-based safety, and no, you can't trademark that. And then we will also talk when they take their breaks. And sometimes I buy their break time with donuts or something sweet to where I know they're going to stand down for 5 minutes and I can capture their attention. But we'll have the conversation, and typically I'll start with the newest person on the crew, knowing that the more tenured, experienced people are going to jump in, and I'll say, hey, I know you're new to this, what do you see as the risks that you're dealing with today at this particular task? And I don't word it that fluffy, but they know what I'm saying. And they'll start rattling off things, and I'll say, great, you're working up in an aerial lift and you're wearing your fall protection, why is that important? And they'll tell me what they think, and then I'll say, what would happen if you weren't wearing it? And they'll tell me what they predict. And we'll have those conversations, and I will capture that in my report so that people can see that we're discussing those things real time out in the field, that they're having those moments of recognition of, oh yeah, I wasn't really thinking of my portable hand drill as a high risk activity, but Ann was talking about that we've had a lot of potential injuries with drills, and now I know what to look for. And it's just a really great and effective conversation, and it's very subtle. They don't feel like I'm preaching to them. It's in an environment where they're comfortable, so we're meeting them where they are instead of bringing them to me in a classroom, and it just works really, really well. So what we did 2 years ago when I held our first OSHA 30 for construction class with all of our crew leaders, is we went through this process of what do you see as the most dangerous things that you do out in the field? And they told me what they thought, and we listed them all out on a piece of paper. And then I explained to them what my history has shown, and this is kind of where the light bulb went on. There is a perception within the safety industry that the most dangerous work is non-routine work. And I was in that camp too for a very, very long time, until at one point in my career, I sat down and I started thinking about all of the significant and serious injuries and fatalities that I had experienced or dealt with over my career, and I put them in a matrix, and I charted them on frequency and severity. And I'll be darned if every single one of those incidents didn't land in the same quadrant on this matrix. And it wasn't the infrequent work. It was the frequent work. It was the routine stuff where people were getting killed or seriously injured. And that was another reckoning moment or a light bulb moment for me, like, holy cow, it's not the non-routine stuff that we do once or twice a year. It's stuff that we're doing all the time. So now we had spent all this time and energy and effort going after job safety analysis for non-routine work, completely bypassing or forgoing the stuff that they were doing every day where people were getting injured and killed. Like, that was a huge shift for me and for us to recognize now we've got to do JSAs for coupling rail cars and, the things that grain elevators do all the time, loading rail cars. So that was just an interesting point that I wanted to share with all of you, that, you don't want to just focus your JSAs in your job hazard analysis, on the non-routine work, you really want to think about where is the danger and use your own company history as the guide for that, and you'll see it maps out consistently with what I just said.
I think we're going to get moving real quick here. I think we're going to be up against our time soon. We did have a great near-miss program. I say great, I mean, I think it was pretty damn good. We were reporting thousands of near misses a year by the time I left the company. One of the things that I really liked was we used near misses to break down these silos to communicate. So when a near miss was entered into our system, it shot out to other facilities. And they would grab these, supervisors would grab them, and they would go over these with their employees. And you saw employees say, hey, somebody else provided value. That could happen here. Wow, didn't know that. And then they really started to snowball. We also had what we called high potential near misses. And high potential near misses were things that, you know, this is a near miss that you look at and say, hey, that could seriously injure or kill somebody. Those near misses, we didn't want company leaders to get 1,000 near misses because they just start, delete, right? But one comes across, it's important. We found that most of our leaders in our company, and this is no fault of theirs, they were not operations people. We were fortunate to have a CEO that was in operations, but a lot of them weren't. We called them bean counters. We were educating them on the exposure and what could possibly happen in their facilities. So that's, you know, the idea of high potential with near misses was really important for us.
So this is basically what I just explained to you, and that was how I differentiated our efforts and our resources. Was I stopped focusing on what I thought non-routine meant, and we just went after what was high risk.
So I just wanted to touch briefly on HOP. I'm not a HOP expert. The presentation yesterday was great. They have a rock star working at Bungie, in my opinion, with what she does.
We think we were HOP before HOP was cool.
We draw a lot of correlations to what we were doing back then to what's going on now. They just took it to the next level, which is awesome. You know, the people are going to err. People are going to make mistakes. That's human nature. Errors can be anticipated. We can put safeguards in there. You kind of have to look at this fail-safe mentality. November 3rd, 2006 was avoidable. There were a lot of things that we could have done differently. I forgot to tell this at the beginning, but when I showed up the next day after Rod had passed away with my boss, we walked out to this tank, and Sean came over, and he said, would you like me to drop a light in through the top of the bridge, and you guys can get an idea of whether the door was flushed or not? And I said, do they normally do that? And he said, yes. They didn't do it that day. So we went up there and stuck our heads in there and let our eyes adjust, and we looked, and my heart sank to my knees because that was the thing that would have probably saved a life. That was a piece of the procedure that was normally done. Later we found out by talking to employees as well that there were other things in the past that they used to do that over time they just weren't doing anymore. There was these threaded rods the guides told me about that they would put in there. They would sometimes just put a payloader bucket up against there. You know, I don't know if that's going to hold or not, but it's something. They had these other safeguards that they would use, and they didn't use any of those on that particular day. So we learned that. So this mentality of, you know, you got to fail safe, have safeguards in place is really important. So, you know, in wrapping up today, recommendations for companies, you know, HOP it's a big animal, right? Yesterday, it's complex. And I know like a lot of my clients aren't probably going to go full-blown HOP. But there are some basic things I think that you could do that will only cost you time. And they are, you know, making sure that you incorporate this concept of the working interface. That's where people get injured. Implement strategies to flush out exposure, things like job safety analysis. Implement that higher of controls thinking, that strategy, that methodology when you identify hazards, and more importantly, you know, lead with safety. Get people to lead with safety. I want to thank you for letting us tell Rod's story. We've never shared this story in a large group before. I've done it in small little groups, and it's usually pretty impactful. We got to the point in our career where we thought like Rod would want us to do this. It's a significant time has gone by. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach to safety. You kind of got to try different things and see what works for you. And we read a book at Safety Made Simple called The Infinite Game, and we believe that safety is an infinite game. You will never reach the finish line. In fact, we went to a conference, learning and development conference in New Orleans in May, and Matthew McConaughey was there. He was the speaker, the keynote. And he said in his life that he never wanted to reach the finish line. He was always going to keep moving that. And when he died, he hoped he was just grasping for it. And in safety, that's what we have to do. We got a little comfortable back then, and I would never let it happen again. Now, Mark Avery told me he was going to heckle me today, but I want everybody to give Mark a round of applause. He is retiring after Jeeps, I understand. And Mark has done more to promote safety in the grain industry than anybody I know. I've worked with him for 14 years on safety tips, webinars, and articles, and all this kind of stuff. He's so dedicated to it. I was actually a little sad, didn't shed a tear, but I attribute a lot of where I am today because Mark helped me along the way. So he was a godsend to me. So thank you, Mark.
Let's give Joe and Ann a round of applause. So Joe and Ann, if you want to join me up here, I've got 3 pages of my own questions, but I know we don't have time for that, Jess. So here's what we're going to do. If out in the audience, if anybody has a question, raise your hand really, really high. My friend, my colleague, Glenn Godino, has a mic. He will come to you. I've got only one request. When you ask a question, if you don't mind stating your name and who you work for or with, that gives Joe and Ann kind of a better opportunity to personalize the question. So Glenn, I'll kind of keep scanning the crowd. Fantastic presentation, you guys. What a way to start the day. You know, it was interesting because as you started off, oh my goodness, I thought, or I had a memory that it's been nearly 23 years since I lost one of my employees in a work-related accident. It was actually in an engulfment of a semi-truckload of grain. And when I think back to when we lost, David was his first name, you know, I immediately think about his family and the impact there. But I also thought about those that far too frequently are not thought of. And that is the coworkers. The folks that David, in my case, or Rod, in your case, worked with every single day. And how it also impacts them and their mental health. Ann, can you talk about that?
Yeah,
how the mental health of those coworkers were addressed.
Right, so this happened on a Friday, and we all needed a weekend to process what was going on, but on Monday morning, the company had arranged for a counselor to come in, and I know you're going to be shocked by what I'm about to say, but men aren't really well known for sharing their feelings. But in this case, it was kind of forced. They were told to come into the safety department. And I remember sitting in a round circle, and the counselor was kind of on the opposite side of the circle from me. And I'm talking probably 18 to 20 people in this circle. And I don't necessarily remember what was said and what was conveyed that day, but I remember one thing. The counselor said, when there's a traumatic event, whether it's at work or at home, you have 48 hours to affect how that's going to live in your mind and how that's going to affect you as a person. And so you have to talk about your grief and about what you've experienced in that first 48 hours to prevent some of that long-term trauma from affecting you later on. And that was something I've never forgotten. And I've had other unfortunate events that have happened in my career since then, and I've always remembered that first 48 hours is so critical to their mental health, and you have to get people talking about it. You can't just say, I'm too macho, we're not going to talk through this. You have to force it.
Very good. Again, questions, please raise your hand. We'll identify you. Glenn, while you're making your way to the gentleman in the front row, Joe, I've got a number for you as well, but let's go back to, what let's go back to SIFs. Of all the efforts that you've tried to prevent these, what was the one thing that's had the most impact?
I think it's when you can sit down with these groups of people and the people that are in that working interface and identify those 5 to 10 things that can seriously injure or kill them. That's that conversation-based safety. You know, another thing that as a consultant, I work with a lot of managers, and if I can just get them, I challenge them a lot to just at the beginning of each day, they usually have a meeting anyway, and it's to just talk about, you know, what are we doing today? What can seriously injure or kill somebody, and what are we going to do about it? And it doesn't have to be a formal checklist or anything like that, but I think that's a big, just get people to start talking about it.
Yeah, really, really good point. Gentleman in the front row, and again, if you don't mind just stating your name, who you're with, please, and then who you're addressing your question to. Thanks.
Absolutely. My name's David Knoll with Purdue Agribusiness. And Ann, my question is really specifically for you. You mentioned that the highest risk, or that a lot of the things that you had looked at, the highest risk was in routine job tasks. And we're currently sorting through this right now, today actually, in our business. And what would you recommend? So you have written policies and procedures in place, correct, for routine tasks?
Routine, yeah.
And where you identified that that's the highest risk for serious injury or fatality, what would you suggest or recommend that folks could do for those routine tasks that they already have looked at, have a standard operating procedure or policy for, things like that? What have you implemented anything, or do you have any suggestions to what you could do to lessen that impact?
Actually, it's what Joe just expressed. It's, you know, you can have the greatest standard operating procedures, but then it really falls back to Andrea's black line, blue line reference yesterday, and the procedure only gets you so far until all those variables start sprinkling in. So what we've found to be the best mitigator of that is those daily pre-shift, pre-job conversations. You know, hey, it looks like it's going to rain, or hey, that ladder over there doesn't look like it's, you know, in the greatest shape. We talked about this, I forgot to mention in my presentation, but I work with millwrights, we do construction, we do repairs and service work. My millwrights have told me one of their biggest dangers and risks is climbing ladders, and not because of the fall potential per se. They've all experienced a ladder rung coming off in their hands on a farm job. Typically doesn't happen on the commercial side of things, but some of these farm bins that have been around for decades and haven't had much love or attention have some sketchy rungs on them, and they've all had somebody pull one off, you know, 40 feet in the air. So having a few examples ready to share with them about how to illustrate this routineness feature was important, and then that really becomes their conversation starters for their daily pre-shift discussions.
Very good. Any more questions? We've got a couple more minutes. Any more questions? Please get your hands up. I've got a question that I'd like both of you to address, but I'm actually going to make it a two-parter. I think overall what I heard this morning was culture, right? That's what I heard, and oftentimes in culture, it's, well, this is the way that we've always done it. That's tough, because that is a culture that is embedded. So I want both of you to address that, but then follow it up with conversations. At my previous employer, we did this, and weekly, these coffee conversations. You sat around tables in small groups. So culture and the importance of conversation, and then we may have time for one more question before we wrap up. Culture and conversation, please.
You know, I think the culture piece is the way we've always done it. This is just the way, it's the most frightening term you could probably possibly hear. And if that's the mentality at an organization, it just tells me all the more that you need to focus on these programs that we've talked about, or these processes we've talked about today, to really look at what are you doing, and do you have safeguards in place for that?
My response to that would be something I had a mentor, excuse me, a mentor and a supervisor earlier on in my career who would challenge that statement about this is how we've always done it. And he would say, were you good or were you just lucky? And I've never forgotten that. And that is always the first thing I come back with when someone says we've always done it that way and no one's ever gotten hurt. Were you good or were you just lucky? And there's always this head nod of, yeah, you're right, there was some luck involved. Doesn't mean you were any safer, it just means you dodged a bullet.
Folks, we've run out of time for this session. Let's give Ann and Joe an incredible round of applause. Thank you guys so much.